let's go ahead and turn to some domestic politics because while we were out over the break, major development in terms of Donald Trump and his various legal battles. So we had covered previously Colorado, the state Supreme Court, issuing a ruling that, if upheld by the Supreme Court, would keep Trump off of that ballot. This under the provision in the Constitution that says you cannot engage in an insurrection if you had previously held an office, taken an oath, et cetera. So now we've got another state attempting to remove Trump from the ballot. You can put this up on the screen. Now, this one came through a slightly different route. Maine's Secretary of State decided to remove Trump from the ballot because of the 14th Amendment's insurrection ban. Maine Secretary of State Shenna Bellows paused her decision pending a potential appeal in state court, which Trump's team said they intend to file. Just to give you some of the nitty-gritty here, they say the decision makes Maine the second state to disqualify Trump from office after the Colorado Supreme Court handed down its own stunning ruling that removed him from the ballot earlier this month. She said her decision will be put on hold until Maine's Superior Court, a trial-level court, makes a ruling. It is not the highest court in the state, but it's the next level where Trump or others can appeal. Maine's laws mandate that the Superior Court must make a decision within 20 days from Thursday. That would be January 17th. So the Maine Superior Court has to weigh in here. That is not the highest level court in Maine, so I assume it'll go all the way up to the Maine Supreme Court. And then very likely, I would assume, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to weigh in on these challenges and how to interpret this part of the Constitution. Maine Secretary of State was pressed on her decision here on CNN. Let's take a listen.
I think it's really important that people understand the process. As a general matter, states have the power to control their own ballots and, in fact, do under the Constitution. And Maine law specifically delegates to me, as Secretary of State, a requirement to review the qualifications for any candidate running for office. So, for example, last week, the Superior Court found that my decision to bar Mr. Chris Christie from Maine's presidential primary ballot due to lack of signatures was lawful and correct. So my job, I qualify Mr. Trump for the ballot, and under Maine law, any registered voter can bring a challenge to that qualification. In this case, there were 3 challenges, and I was required by law to hold a hearing, an administrative hearing, to review the evidence, hear testimony. Both sides were represented by counsel. Mr. Trump was represented by an attorney, and then I'm required to issue a decision. That's my obligation under the oath I swore to the Constitution.
In terms of the criticism that your decision takes away the right for voters to have their voice heard, do you believe that's a valid concern?
Again, my first and foremost obligation is my oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. Now, different states are different. For example, our neighboring New Hampshire, there are more than a dozen candidates on the Democratic presidential ballot, but Mr. Joseph Biden is not on the Democratic presidential primary ballot in New Hampshire. And there are more than a dozen Republican candidates. In Maine, there are 2 candidates on the Democratic presidential primary ballot and less than a dozen Republican presidential candidates. So every state is different. My obligation and duty, my sole consideration, is my oath to uphold the Constitution.
So, Emily, you and I haven't talked either about Maine or about Colorado, also with their Supreme Court decision that would ban Trump from the ballot. That's now been put on hold, waiting for what happens at the Supreme Court. But what are some of your overall thoughts about what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really difficult to watch this play out, knowing that, as awful, and I say this all the time, I was there on January 6th covering the riot, and it's one of the worst, if not the single worst thing that I've ever seen. I've covered riots. That was the worst of the worst that I've ever seen, and it was awful. And Donald Trump was playing with fire, and he bears responsibility for it. He has not been charged with insurrection. And Krystal, there are historic, I think, differences between what was being discussed. And we have an article on this, actually. You can put C3 up on the screen. This is from ABC News. What was being discussed as the 14th Amendment was written, very specifically about people who took up arms personally, personally took up arms against the United States. Now, the 14th Amendment does have a point about people who gave aid or comfort to people who took up arms against the United States, and that sort of makes it much more open-ended and kind of vague, but it has never been interpreted in this way at all. And with nobody, let alone Donald Trump, being charged with insurrection, and I don't say that to mean that Jack Smith should charge Donald Trump with insurrection, personally, with the kind of insurrection that Confederates did when they literally fought to the death people from their own country to preserve, as Nikki Haley is a little bit scared to say, the institution of slavery. We could get into that, Krystal, but really there's no need to, because there's no point to talking about Nikki Haley anymore. But I mean, this was a very specific. This is a very, very specific phenomenon that was being addressed in the 14th Amendment about taking up arms and fomenting an insurrection, a war against your own country. And Donald Trump had insane disagreements, some that he didn't even believe in, I think is very clear, and did mislead people about. I continue to think that's one of the most disgusting parts of all of this, is the way Donald Trump treats his own voters. And you know, he did horrible things. That's all true. Charging him with insurrection, Krystal, it not only do I think it is legally wrong, or not charging him with insurrection, but then taking him off the ballot, not only do I think it's legally wrong and dubious and sets a terrifying precedent, I also think it's really pushing us towards the brink of something very, very frightening. It feels like a recipe for a lot more January 6th going forward. When you kind of take that out of the voters' hands, people feel powerless. It makes people feel powerless more and more, and that's when people get desperate. So the whole thing is frightening.
But I mean, we already are on the brink of something ugly. We
That's
already had January 6th. Like, I mean, I'm thinking about 2024, and like, I'm normally so excited about a presidential election year because I'm such a political nerd. Like, I can't even imagine a good outcome. There is no outcome that appears to be on the menu that is a good outcome. So I think the legal issues here are genuinely very tricky. Yeah, I read the Colorado State Supreme Court ruling and like all of the different pieces that they were grappling with. I just want to read for people what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment actually says in terms of the just like plain, English meaning that people are taking from, because you do have a majority of Americans, actually a pretty strong majority, including a quarter of Republicans, who said, yeah, I actually agree with the Colorado Supreme Court on this. So it says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the U.S. or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the U.S. shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof, but Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. So we just had the Colorado GOP appeal the state Supreme Court ruling there. One thing that was interesting to me is they did not actually contest on the grounds that Trump was not engaged in or giving aid or comfort to the enemies engaged in an insurrection. They challenged some of these more technical legal pieces, including whether the president of the United States is a, quote, office of, that this would apply to, which I always have thought was preposterous. And one of the things that that news article we had up a moment ago mentions is that in the debate over the language of this amendment, this actually came up. There's a single reference in that Senate debate to the fact that president and vice president are not specifically mentioned in this draft. And a Maryland Democratic senator said, why did you omit to exclude them? And this person who drafted it responded, let me call the senator's attention to the words or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States is included. And that ended the discussion, basically meaning like, well, it says any office. Like, of course, the president is included here. So it was interesting to me that the Republican Party that filed this appeal did not actually take issue with the idea that Trump engaged in an insurrection or gave aid and comfort to it with some of these tricky legal issues. So listen, my view is it's appropriate to have this provision in the Constitution to protect the state from, insurrectionists and people who give aid and comfort to insurrectionists. I think it is appropriate to have this in.
Sagar.
I think it is
Protect
very
people
right,
from
like Sagar.
Yeah.
Gotta keep Sagar out of office. I think that the only appropriate avenue in terms of the vagueness of this provision and the fact that it hasn't been applied in modern times really since the Civil War, or at least very rarely, I think it's entirely appropriate for it to go to the Supreme Court and for them to set the guidelines of here's the process, here's the definition, here's what it means, here's how and here's how we can here's how we can work with this moving forward. The last thing, and I'll call your attention to in that news article about what the debate was at the time is, there's a question of whether this was even meant to apply to future insurrections or if it was really just specifically for the Civil War. And there was some language in the debate about, they say, this is to go into our Constitution and to stand to govern future insurrection as well as the present. And I should like to have that point definitely understood. So there was a sense at the time. And, for the conservative justices who claim to be originalists and to look at what the meaning and intent was at the time and to look at the plain text reading of the language of the Constitution, the Colorado Supreme Court in particular wrote there. My cat's going crazy in the background, guys.
Your cat is fomenting an insurrection against your chair.
Salem is going to be barred from holding office in that chair. Anyway, they really wrote the language to sort of challenge the judicial approach of the conservative justices. Now, what do I think is going to happen? I think they're going to say, no, Trump's going to be on the ballot. I think it's very unlikely that they uphold the Colorado State Supreme Court decision. But, Maggie Haberman did actually say something about, I guess Trump is kind of worried that his own justices that he put on there might flip on him and keep him off the ballot. So listen, crazier things have happened, I guess. You never know.
Yeah. First of all, Crystal's cat has turned her chair into the teacups at Disney World. It's just riding. It's amazing. Smart. But I think we can put the last element up on the screen too. That's another thing, where the legality of this is tricky or dubious. Time magazine says Americans appear more amenable to autocracy in 2024, but they're alluding there to very real polling. And if you look at the RCP averages, for example, of Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, you see this, Ryan described it as like an alligator jaw or crocodile jaw, I forgot which one he said, as soon as the indictment started coming down, of Trump's support just going up, DeSantis' support just going down, that the sort of ongoing lawfare against Trump just solidifies people's support for him. And that's where, Crystal, to your point, some Republicans are involved in filing these challenges and some Republicans supporting what Colorado's decision was. Donald Trump is just incredibly polarizing. And I think maybe one thing that we can agree on is the Democrats have, and never Trump kind of Republicans, sort of desperately have flung lawfare at Donald Trump since 2015, when the dossier was first funded by Republicans, by the way. They've tried to thwart Donald Trump in every way except actually persuading the voters that they shouldn't support Donald Trump. They've not figured out the persuasive argument for this hardened 30% of the country that supports Donald Trump to the point where he can win a primary and then convince another 20% of the country that the other option is so bad that they have to go with Donald Trump for a number of different reasons for a number of different voters, and that again is the real that's another real problem that hangs over all of this, is that argument of things are. Joe Biden is talking about the economy as though everything is rosy, and of course he is. He's been president for a couple of years in the middle of a re-election campaign. He wants to say we've made progress, and there's an argument that some progress has been made, but people express they aren't feeling like the economy is the same way that Joe Biden is talking about the economy. They express that they're not feeling the same way about geopolitical stability and American leadership on the world stage as Joe Biden is saying that they should. And that's where Trump comes in and is persuasive to a lot of people. So there's still an incredible vacuum in the persuadability of a chunk of the country. Not everyone. We're extremely polarized around the issue of Trump and very polarized in general. But that continues, I think, to be a real handicap for Trump's enemies.
I think I saw some other polling about America's rising comfort with authoritarianism. And that sentiment is most strongly expressed among the like hardest partisan Republicans, but the rise is significant regardless of political ideology. And to me, it gets to something you're pointing to here, which is that it's not that Democrats haven't tried to persuade people they shouldn't vote for Donald Trump. They certainly have tried. But what they've been unwilling to do or unable to do, given their own, like, compromised situations and sea of money in politics that infects both parties, they've been unable and unwilling to offer an affirmative, positive agenda that is a viable alternative. And so to me, it's very logical and, very clear if you look at history that if people feel like democracy isn't delivering for them, then they may sour on democracy or they may, not prioritize democracy. And I think that's a lot of what you're seeing here is people feel like, whoever I vote for in this upcoming election, it's not going to help me. It's not going to affect my life. They don't feel like the stakes of these elections aren't really the same because there's no expectation that either major political party is going to actually deliver for them. And so instead it's like, all right, well, who's on my side in the culture war? Who's like owning or hating on the person that I also hate? And that's what our politics devolves to, as well as willingness to reach for authoritarian tactics to keep the group that you see as an existential threat, that you've been told by media is an existential threat, to try to keep them at bay. So I think that's part of what's going on here. In terms of like the lawfare against Donald Trump, I mean, there's no doubt about it, like the Russiagate nonsense, all that stuff. But you do have to separate out like which of these claims are legitimate and have some basis and which are just total like fabricated distraction and bullshit. So the fact that some of the claims are distraction and bullshit does not mean that all of the claims are distraction and bullshit. And I think there's a reason why the normie reaction to the language in 14th Amendment, Section 3 has been like, oh yeah, that sounds like him. Like that kind of fits. Because it does. If you just read it, you're like, well, if it applies to anyone, it's this dude. So, like I said, where do I think this is going to go? Ultimately, I think the Supreme Court's going to strike it down. And so it's not going to really, matter that much. But I guess you never know what could happen. And it's certainly a test of where we are as a country. And it will be a test of how everyone reacts to what's going on here.
Yeah, I agree. And we will expect something on these cases legally in just the next couple of days. So there's a lot of news to stay tuned to when it comes to these ballot qualification questions.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.